You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, today we're heading into the final round of this year's Arts Madness tournament. I want to start by saying a big thank you to everyone who's participated and voted for their favorites over the last 5 weeks. And as always, I appreciate all of you listening and sharing part of your day with me. Be sure to go to whoartedpodcast.com/vote to weigh in on our final matchup between Maurizio Catalan and Katsushika Hokusai. Now, I don't want to put my thumb on the scales in the tournament, but today's episode is somewhat about Hokusai. I am fortunate that a local museum is putting on an exhibition of work from the Ukiyo-e period, including work by Hokusai, Hiroshige, and others. The Cleve Carney Museum at the College of DuPage has a collection that is coming to the United States for the first time ever. And so any listeners in the Chicago area, I would highly encourage you to check it out. The show opens May 31st, but you can buy tickets now at hokusai2025.org. Now, on with the show.
Feel like who art ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and I am very excited. Joining me today, I'm doing another curator talk. I'm speaking with Justin Whitty, the curator of the Cleve Carney Museum at the College of DuPage. My local college is putting together an exhibition of Hokusai, and I am so excited for this opening. Thank you so much, Justin, for joining me.
Absolutely, Kyle. Happy to be here.
So I am very excited because, I think a lot of people don't even realize colleges are a wonderful wealth of so many different resources, including museums and galleries, and there are art collections that are absolutely stunning in these local spaces. And, the College of DuPage has done some amazing stuff. They had the Frida Kahlo exhibition, Andy Warhol, and now Hokusai is coming to us. And for local listeners in the Chicago area, I'm going to tell everyone, please come out to see the Hokusai exhibition at the Cleve Carney Museum of College of DuPage on May 31st or after, right? It opens May 31st?
Yeah, the show opens May 31st, runs through September 21st. So it's throughout the summer and the beginning of the fall. And it's Hokusai and Ukiyo-e because it's actually a number of different artists in the show from the Edo period in Japan, Hokusai being one of them, one of the most known, but also other well-known artists like Hiroshige. And it's a fascinating story. A lot of people hear that and they think, oh, is this the show I saw at the Art Institute? Well, the Art Institute had a wave print that Hokusai made on display last summer, and that's all they had. They didn't have a large exhibition. Ours is actually a collection that has never been shown in the U.S. before, and it comes from Italy, of all places. And that's because it comes from the Edoardo Schiassone Museum in Genoa, Italy. And Edoardo Schiassone was a very revered artist and figure in Japan at the end of the 1800s. He was hired to come to Japan and help them modernize their engraving techniques for the creation of currency. So he went over and helped them make really beautiful, intricate currency that was harder to counterfeit. It was more in line with the rest of the world. But when he was there, he fell in love with Japanese art and began collecting it. And when he died, because he spent the rest of his life in Japan, he left his collection back to his childhood, or not his childhood, to the Art Academy in Genoa, where he was a student. And that became the museum, the Schiassone Museum in Genoa, Italy, which has the largest collection of Japanese artwork in Europe. So that's where this is coming from. And this collection of work from that museum has never even been in the U.S. So this is not something that people have seen before. Like, they recognize the name, And it's not just Hokusai. There's a lot of different examples. There's obviously his beautiful woodblock prints, but there's also original hand-painted scrolls, paintings, objects, and then a lot more that's part of the exhibition, which we can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, and so, listeners, you might recognize the names Hokusai and Hiroshige because I have done previous episodes on both of those artists. So I would encourage everyone to listen to those before you go to the exhibition because, I always got to self-promote. But that's interesting that the collection is coming from Italy, the Japanese work coming from an Italian museum. And I guess because of happenstance, he was traveling, that makes sense to travel and see the world and learn about these printing methods. And obviously Japan has such a rich tradition in printing and everything like that. But I'm curious in the modern age, or I guess the contemporary society, because I got to be careful with terms like modern when I'm talking to a curator. But today, as this is the first time it's coming over to the U.S., how does that come about? Like, what are do like all of you curators have a Slack channel where you're just like, I'm looking for a Hokusai, who's got a Da Vinci? What can you give me? Like, how does this logistically come together that you find these pieces are available and you put them together for your show?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and there may be a Slack channel like that, but I'm not on it. And there are definitely, organizations, curatorial organizations, and personal relationships between people at different institutions that always allow for conversation about a sense of ideas people are having or what's available. And then there's also, like anything else, you build up connections with different people throughout the world that come into play at different times. So the interesting story for this exhibit for us actually goes back to 2020, 2021, when we were doing the Frida Kahlo exhibit, which featured 26 Frida Kahlo paintings from the Dolores Olmedo Museum in Mexico City. One of the key people from that museum that we worked with on that exhibition, along with, unfortunately, a lot of other staff from that museum, left shortly after our exhibit because the collection from the Olmedo Museum is going on a 40-year loan to Mexico City. So, interesting side note, anyone who came out to the College in DuPage and saw our show, they saw pieces like Broken Column by Frida Kahlo, that the last time they will have been shown in the U.S. for the next 4 decades will have been here at COD. So anyway, our contact got a new position with an Italian company called Mondo Mostra. And Mondo Mostra actually has a unique position in that they work with institutions in Italy and Europe on the logistics of loaning work throughout the world. And she told them, like, hey, there's this great community college in the suburbs of Chicago you should talk to. And I'm sure at first they thought she was a little crazy, but that was the introduction. And then we started talking to them about ideas, and we heard about the availability of this collection, that Chiosone was interested in showing it in the US. And because the work from this period is so popular and influential on contemporary work and contemporary culture, if you think about manga or anime, it felt like there was a lot of audiences we could reach with it. So that's why we decided to go after this collection. Along the way, there were other leads that came close. We had one that was pretty much buttoned up, but then it was an artist who was still alive, who passed away, and then kind of the estate got caught up in kind of all the turmoil that happens when someone passes away. So there's always kind of potential avenues that open up, and you follow them as far as you can, and it might work out, but you always have to have this idea that maybe it won't come together. And also sometimes, institutions, especially larger institutions, will collaborate, pooling their collections to create a larger show that then travels around, you see that a lot as well. So drawing on their resources, pairing it with another large institution. Since we're kind of a unique position, being a community college museum, not just a college museum, that we've had to really had to work to kind of establish ourselves in that world because it's not a traditional route.
So then, can I ask you, because as you describe this, it sounds to me like it was almost a collection, a bundle of works that were ready for you to secure, or do you have this idea? Do you have this idea ahead of time? Like, okay, I'm really interested in Ukiyo-e, and I want to put together a collection with different pieces from that time, and then you start to assemble from these different sources and ask around on what's available,
Mm-hmm.
or was it like, you were looking around and you talked to your contacts and, there's kind of a collection that's ready to go? It sounds to me like it was a collection almost ready to exhibit from that Italian museum and maybe some other stuff added in.
Yeah. So that works both ways with exhibits. So this collection of work exists as the collection of that museum. So when we found out about its availability, then it was a matter of us collaborating with the curators of that museum on the selection of which works we would have in our exhibit. So in that case, it is coming from one source. The show we did like 2 years ago with Andy Warhol, we pulled from several different sources because we had the idea of we wanted to do the artist first. So I think it happens both ways. And this is definitely, it's coming from a singular collection, but the kind of the pieces being paired together and being presented, it's not like that exact show existed. In addition, all of the exhibits that we do here, we create a lot of auxiliary exhibits that are one of a kind and only exist at COD. So while the work from the Salon will be in the museum galleries, which is only 2,500 square feet at our school, we have an additional 8,000 square feet of exhibitions that we've created originally that are directly related to the work on loan. So a lot of, not only is this collection coming to the States for the first time, most of what people will experience when they come to the exhibit is stuff that only exists here. And that includes, an in-depth exhibition about history of Edo, Japan, and kind of the environment in which this artwork developed. And then also why it became so popular. Back to your question of why we chose this work, especially the work in late Edo, the later Ukiyo-e period, really benefited from the kind of birth of globalization in a way. Because even if you look at the most iconic work people associate with this time, that's Under the Wave off Kanagawa, the Great Wave by Hokusai, a lot of elements in that print were not possible if it weren't for influence from the West, specifically through the Dutch, who were the only country, Western country, allowed to trade with Japan up until the 1850s. The color, the Prussian
Berlin
blue that's in
blue,
there,
right?
Yeah, that was not available until it was introduced by the Western. Also, what you see in a lot of Hokusai's work is this use of Western perspective that was different than the very stacked space that you would see in previous Japanese work. So the most exciting work start to happen when there starts to be a cross pollination between cultures, which even makes more sense because Hiroshige then, kind of built on that as well. And then his work goes on to really influencing so many Western artists like Vincent van Gogh and other Impressionists. What's also fascinating about this work in this period is it's a moment in the world where there starts to be this really international and relatively rapid cross-pollination of images and ideas that's really continued to unfold until today. And ironically, with some of the same works like The Wave or, of Hiroshige's work still continue to influence people as well.
Oh, absolutely. Now, if I could turn, it kills me to turn away from the art, but I'm just so curious about the logistics. So like
Sure.
after you've picked out the works that you want for this collection, I
Mhm.
just wonder, like, physically, how does this all come together? Like I don't imagine someone in Italy is just like dropping these prints in a media mailer and hoping it makes it through. Like,
No.
can you
Yeah.
just walk us through, like, what is your process? Like, everything from, like, how do you care for the packaging and shipping and
Mhm.
everything like that, but also the hanging, the display, what do you do
Right.
to protect it, and how do you lay it
Mhm.
out, how do you figure all of this stuff out, just the logistical hurdles and everything involved in putting together a great exhibition.
Yeah, so I think when you think about a show like this or a show with any valuable works, you're not just presenting work; you're presenting historical objects. So they have not only a really high monetary value, but a high kind of cultural historical value. So it's very important to ensure their protection throughout, but also, as in the case of the show, the work is older and more fragile, more prone to a lot of issues when exposed to elements, right? So you're wanting to present a show to present to the public, to educate them, to expose them to culture, but you're also dealing with handling and presenting very valuable and old artifacts. So there's a lot of elements that then come into play to ensure all of that lines up and coincides. So the first is, say after we've chosen the work and we come to an agreement, before a final contract is agreed on, a lending institution would have to see condition reports from the borrowing institution that show, not condition reports, sorry, facility reports that kind of explain the physical properties of the space, both in terms of its climate control, its security, the distance from the loading dock to the museum, how much staff it has, when it's staffed, how the security is covered, what is the average humidity and temperature over a set amount of time. If they want to ask specifically for records from that period, we would have to send them the charts from our hydrothermographs, which are, if it's going to a museum and you see these little machines in the corner that look like they're measuring earthquakes, those are actually analog measurements of the humidity and temperature in the spaces. And we have to keep those because they become an analog proof of what the consistent range is, because they don't want to send work to a physical space where there is drastic change in temperature or humidity, because that could affect the work, right?
Yeah, see, I always thought about lighting. I wasn't thinking about the
Yeah.
humidity.
Well, we're not even at the lighting part, right?
Yeah.
And then they look at your record of exhibitions, and then they can ask. Now, we're lucky that organizations like AAM, the American Association of Museums, standardizes a lot of this in terms of forms. So they have like a standardized facility report form that not only gives institutions a form in which to share this information, but also so people know what to ask for, what to look for. So that kind of guides the development of these forms. So they see that. Then you have to agree on the what the shipping will be and what the insurance will be and how that's covered. Now, a lot of times, shipping, everything's crated, right? Like in really heavy duty crates, because that's to protect it. And it's shipped by art shippers. So movers who are specifically trained in the handling of valuable freight, so that it's not just thrown and slapped around or tilted or anything like that. And also delivered in climate controlled vehicles as well. So you can't leave it in the back of like a 150-degree truck, right? That could ruin the works. You agree on who you're doing for that, how that's going to work. And then once that agreement comes, you then also have to agree, like, who are the people going to be involved? So to ensure that all of this happens properly, oftentimes a lender will require that couriers travel from their institution with the work. So that's someone to go along the way to make sure every aspect of that shipment is properly carried out. And then they're also arrive at the institution and they help the registrars at the institution. So those are the people kind of registering the reception of the work, making sure all the forms and paperwork are ready. And the conservators, who are the ones who inspect the work, they're professionals in terms of the conservation and kind of materiality and care of the work. They have to be present when that work's shown too, when it's delivered, because when it's opened, you have a member from the lenders, people from the lending institution, from the borrowing, you have a conservationist inspecting it, and the registrar. And then what they're doing is they'll look at a condition report. This is a report that was filled out when the work left its lending institution, wherever it was leaving last time. It says, here's the condition of this piece. Here's everything we noticed. There's a piece of dust on this corner. Maybe there's a crack from 20 years ago up here. There's a repair on the back. Mm-hmm. It's all marked and written. And then the conservator looks over the artwork, compares it, notes any changes. So if anything did change in the travel, they have to note it. And the people from the lending institution have to sign off on it to acknowledge, like, yes, it arrived this way. And then all that paperwork serves as the same forms that are referred to when the work is packed up and shipped out, because they have to once again guarantee it's all in that shape. So there's a lot of people involved, a lot of time involved, and it can, in some cases, also involve a certain amount of security and secrecy. So, like with the Kahlo exhibit, it was over $300 million worth of paintings that were cultural heritage of Mexico, irreplaceable. So then the work's flying out on multiple flights, because if one plane goes down, they don't want to lose all of the artwork. And you don't share the information except a select few about when those flights are going, because you don't want to open up any avenue for possible theft or anything like that. So that's also an element of it, that the specific times and places these things are delivered are not shared broadly, because it has to be protected as well. So that's one whole part of it. And the cost of that is a lot too, because just ensuring the works, takes quite a bit. And then you go all through all that, and then you have your professional preparators, is a term you may have heard. The art world likes to use terms that no one else uses. So I don't know why. So you're not really like, oh yeah, preparator. That's someone who handles and hangs artwork and does different aspects of museum installation. We have a head preparator who's one of the best in the Chicago area, Jim Lambricks. He works all the museums, worked extensively at the Art Institute. Very renowned, and he'll bring in a team, and then they, under the supervision of the registrar and conservator, will hang the work in predetermined locations where everything's ready, get it up, secure it. Now, depending on each work is different, right? But you have to make sure it's secured to the wall. And then if it needs framing, it'll be, it arrives framed, or sometimes in the case of like scrolls or things like we're getting in this show, you have already beforehand created specific display furniture or items or cases. So we're building a lot of custom cases and displays for this work. So it'll be under vitrines and protected from touch through vitrines and different kind of protections. So then it's installed. And then you worry about the lighting, right? And with this work, a lot of it being paper, the light has to be fairly low, because a lot of works of paper, especially older, you don't want to expose them to a lot of light, because any work on paper, any work really only has so much light it can be exposed to in its lifetime before it fades away. Mm-hmm. And the idea of an institution or conservator is you try to stretch that as long as possible by still allowing people to be able to see the work. So oftentimes you'll see work, especially works on paper, in collections of museums, but it's not on display very often because it's resting. So for instance, the single wave print that the Art Institute had on display last summer. Again, that was just one print. They didn't have a whole Hokusai show, just one print. It's one of three they have in their collection of the original woodblock prints of the wave. But they only show those once every 7 years, and then they rest from the light. So then that's another consideration. And we have most of that set up beforehand because we want to get as close as possible. And then once it's up, we're checking light levels and adjusting and all of that work. So, and then when you leave, you do it all in reverse.
So before we skip too far ahead to that ending and the reverse process, you have got this whole show kind of mapped out. You're building the furniture, you know where it's all going to go. Now, after a short break, I want to have you walk us through it and talk about some of the gems in this collection that viewers are going to see.
Sure.
So today I am thrilled. I'm talking to Justin Whitty, curator at the Cleve Carney Gallery at the College of DuPage, which is going to be having an amazing Hokusai exhibition, or I guess Ukiyo-e exhibition. I keep talking about Hokusai because longtime listeners know I'm a huge fan. Love the Great Wave. Done multiple episodes on Hokusai and Hiroshige. I find all of that stuff fascinating, and I'm very excited about this show, which for listeners in the Chicago area, it is opening May 31st at the Cleve Carney Museum, College of DuPage. You know, set your calendars, make sure you make the trip out, because first time it's coming to America here. But I want you to sort of walk us through this collection. Like, when I walk into the gallery space, what am I going to see first? Like, and also, what's your thought process as you mapped this out? Like, were you thinking, because in my mind, a good show sort of tells a story about the work and the culture and what influenced what. Like, what's the story of this show? What do you want us to learn from it? But I guess first, what are we going to see?
Actually, the first thing when you come this summer is you'll come to a large hall area where there's a very large exhibition that we've created that you only see at the college. And that really starts to tell the story. What it's doing is setting the framework where you presenting the audience, like, what was unique about Edo, Japan? What was unique about that roughly 300-year period from the 16th to the 19th century that allowed for the development of such influential and distinctive works? And within that, it tells the story of Hokusai and Hiroshige and how they fit into that story, and also how it was influenced by both political, like religious, and artistic realities of that time. So you're getting this background, this context, even so much minute detail of like how woodblock prints were made and why woodblock prints were popular at that time, and how complex they actually were, and the importance of how this work has influenced work up until today. So you see all that before you go to the galleries that have the work. So you have this baseline understanding of really what is a fascinating story. And then when you're coming in, it's really about then saying, if you understand this framework, here is some work specifically from the Ukiyo-e school within Edo, right? So that wasn't the only work that was made, but it was work that was typified by the representation of kind of the everyday life in Edo, in Tokyo. Edo is Tokyo, right? Of the entertainment district. So you get the portraits of actors, of beauties, of streetscapes, of games, things that were really geared towards what was a large and growing merchant, or what we would call like middle class, that really came to Edo to experience all of that culture and excitement. So that's the type of work you're seeing. So then within it, break it up. It's broken up kind of into categories of arts, dance, and music. So works by like artists such as Utagawa Kunisada, like really beautiful portraits of actors, like really dramatic. Most people would recognize them, of actors in full face paint, being very expressive. And then it goes to images of pastimes and games. One of my favorite pieces in that section is from Utagawa Konoyoshi. He is probably most known for like his really he creates incredibly fantastic otherworldly images of imagined creatures. You should check them out. They seem so contemporary and influential everywhere from like modern comics to modern horror. I would really mention you check those really fantastic works. And then that also has actual artifacts, right? So we have card games and lacquered boxes and instruments hand painted from that period. And then into a section that focuses on a lot of the beauties and the geisha of the period, which these are hand painted scrolls that you'll see. And what's so beautiful about these is the patterns and the colors and how the artists in this period really represented that kind of overlapping pattern and bright color in their work in such a graphic, but very, in a way that was still very accurate in its depiction, but like beautifully graphic in a very contemporary, modern way. And then you finally start getting to the names, the big names you talked about before, because you talk about life in the city and outside of the city. So then you start to get to a lot of the landscapes, which is what the two artists we've mentioned the most, Shige and Hokusai, have really focused a lot on. So you then see a lot of their works, in addition to more hand-painted scrolls that actually have like a New Year's street scene of Edo from the 1600s. So that's how you're going to encounter that space. But then when you leave, it doesn't end there because we want to continue that experience. We are located in an art center at the college, right? Mm-hmm. And when we do these larger shows, we collaborate with the entire art center. That means we have a talented staff of set designers and builders, costumers. So in one of our theaters then is actually a recreation of a Edo bookstore, like a full like walk-in. You'll be able to see that and check that out. And then you'll go, and we are working with a 2D restaurant, which is a restaurant run by two artists in the Fulton Market area in Chicago, Kevin Yu and Vanessa Vu. And they are very influenced by manga. So they're creating a complete kind of immersive exhibition that tells the story, the development of manga from Hokusai, who, as you know, published the first
Hokusai
manga, which was different than
not manga as we think of it today, but it did have that term, Hokusai
it did
manga.
Have that term, and it was kind of widely produced, published, a book of drawings. In some ways, even had some paneled storytelling in it. So there was some seeds of that development all the way through contemporary, what we think of as like manga and anime today, and that's going to be a completely kind of hand-drawn environment. And what that means is you walk into it, it'll be dimensional, but every element is going to be treated as if it's a drawing. So the visual will be like you're walking into a comic kind of space. And then we have a garden that Ball Horticulture is helping us design. And then we have a family learning area. We have traditional clothing and costumes from that period on loan, actually from Warner Brothers of all places, and interactive educational elements that we are actually borrowing from the Seattle Art Museum, who also recently had a Japanese art exhibition. So there's a lot of elements going on. So that's how you experience. I know that I kind of strayed away from your initial answer, but I wanted to like share the full breadth of what they would experience.
Well, and I'm amazed at just the number of things you're doing to create an experience that is so immersive and so, and, you know, we can appreciate and understand on these different dimensions. I mean, we first come in and we can learn some of that background knowledge that sets the stage for us to understand and appreciate the work. But then all these other extensions from the, you know, the restaurant to the landscaping and these different people that you're working with. And so that raises a question for me of like, how do you find all of these partners to work with, like the restaurant? Like, how do you find all these different people?
That actually, it won't be a restaurant. They just started doing this at their restaurant in Fulton
Yeah.
Market. That's how they got attention. So it's actually another exhibit space. But it's called 2D Restaurant. So, it really starts with an idea of what could be interesting, and then seeking out partners that you think could help. So, the way I start every exhibition, and I should say, like, there are parts of this exhibition that I'm not even working on, right? Like the the recreation of a bookshop. That is the theater department's working on that. The garden, I'm not really working on that, but a lot of it, when I've conceived a lot of it, it really even starts just on a whiteboard, right? I know that we have these elements coming in the gallery. What's the story? How are we presenting them in that space? What do I feel like would be helpful for people to know before they enter that space?
Mm-hmm.
How do we tell that story? And then when thinking about how to tell it, how do we still also make it kind of a visually interesting and engaging space to interact with? For me, there's always has to be this excitement element of what is that physical space going to be like that kind of drives it. So a lot of my initial work with our assistant curator, Julia Walker, is really whiteboards, and it's drawing out possible layouts, kind of blocking areas. Like, this area will contain this work and talk about that. Before we even fleshed out all the text, we just know. So people will encounter this part of the story first and move to that part and then that part. And in this case, to make it interesting, like, we're building giant curved walls in that first exhibit. So it kind of mimics Flow of the Wave. And then there's a 2-story mural of like clouds taken from Hokusai prints that fade down all the way to the ground where the info is. So it feels like you're actually walking into Ukiyo-e print. So then you start to get excited about those ideas, and then you start fleshing out the details of the text and the information. And then early on in the process, you're also identifying what would be good other areas to share with the public. And we know manga is so popular and anime is so popular. We really wanted to do something about that, but we also, honestly, we didn't know a lot about it, like the contemporary anime or manga. That wasn't our specialty. So we knew about this restaurant. They had actually worked kind of with partners with us before in Warhol, where they did something special at their space in Chicago. So we reached out to Kevin and Vanessa, who have started to do a lot of projects with different museums. They just did something at the Milwaukee Art Museum as well. And just said, would you be interested in doing something about the history of this? Here's the space. We just want to make sure it's it really tells a history. And I want to make sure it's from that line from Hokusai to contemporary times. And then they said, well, what about this? And we're like, and they presented 4 distinct rooms that they were going to create. And then that gets to a point in the process where there are certain things you also have to trust other talented people to carry out. Like, we had this idea for this area to have a certain message, finding talented people that you look at their work and then trust them, because they also need that kind of creative interest in it for it to be exciting, right? You can't just dictate, like, they're not just labor, they're also providing the creative aspect to it. And then those things just kind of keep happening. You start like, well, what if we had something like X? Who might be a good person? You talk to a few people, and we've developed quite a few connections over the years that we always find kind of a place to start. But you don't know, where it will end up. And the other thing I want to mention is you kind of, in describing the show, you describe these immersive areas. I think immersive is a really tricky word in the art world now, right? Because the immersive experience was kind of unrolled, early pandemic of like rooms with just projections on the walls and the floors.
Oh yeah. It's not that is what I was. I was not thinking that, and I don't want to suggest that, right?
No, and I understand that. And the thing with those is people would go to those and there wasn't a lot of content, right? It was like a Instagram backdrop. But there's a seed. There's a seed in those that kind of acknowledges that audiences now, expect more, but also live in a really multimedia world to such an extent that we have to broaden how we think about presenting exhibitions. And I think what we do really well at the college is we allow for in some of the areas, allow for some of that creativity and kind of boundary pushing, but we're very rigorous in maintaining the content and the authenticity of the work. And that's what's so great, to be able to keep the actual objects in the museum and build these other exhibits around it. Because at no point are you kind of pulling away from the resonance of the actual objects, but you're only kind of building up that excitement and awareness and pouring back into them by kind of capturing people with these other exhibit spaces.
Yeah. And I guess we'll take one more short break before I ask to sort of wrap it up with just a few more insights into the work, the story of the exhibition, and all the other greatness happening this summer. Now, again, I'm so thrilled to be talking to a curator, just because I am a nerd and get excited about talking to people who get to see and put their hands on some amazing works of art. But I imagine it's probably not as fun for you as I like to pretend it would be. Like can you tell us, you've given us a little insight into the role of the curator in terms of the logistics, and a little bit even about that process of brainstorming at the whiteboard of what's the story we're telling with this. But can you tell us anything else that people may not realize about the role of the curator, the considerations of an exhibition, or just anything else you want us to see and appreciate when we come to see this show this summer?
Yeah, I think in terms of your question about a curator, it's a good one, and I think you would get a lot of different responses. I came into this role through a route that was, I was trained as an artist all the way through grad school. The reason I moved to Chicago area was to go to UIC in Chicago, where I was in the studio arts program. And along the way, I kind of worked as a job in the installation of artwork. And that kind of is what introduced me to museums. And then over time and over years, it developed into administration and coordination, and then finally curating the exhibit. So I've always, to me, it's always thinking about being part of just this process of putting on an exhibit. It was never for me this idea of I want to be a big all caps curator. But when I think about that question of what's important about that role, it is in the storytelling, but I think it also it's about a responsibility to the artists and the artwork. Because to really present it in an honest and impactful way in which people can get the full experience, access to the work, there has to be an understanding of that. So there's the research component of the work, but also of the artists and considerations of other historical or societal events that are impacting that situation. But then really crafting that presentation to both guide an audience to that, but while leaving enough room for the work to still exist. So it's this balancing act. And ultimately, what the curator is doing, is, in addition to kind of in exhibitions choosing which works to use to pinpoint the story or to make the statement they're hoping to with that exhibit, is researching and crafting all the text that goes along with the presentation of the work that reinforces that story as well. Thinking about very strongly the design and presentation of the work, because how you travel through an exhibit is just as important as the text on the wall, how you encounter things, how they're presented. And then I think what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of what it is like what we're doing right now is you continue to tell that story throughout the exhibit, not just in it, but in the community, through talks, through speaking with other people. And for me, the key to that is you have to have a passion about it, right? You have to be able to see how what you could crassly look at just objects, but how they contain the history and ideas and kind of impact, and how powerful that seed can be. And when it presented well and shared, it kind of breathes new life into it so it can continue forward. And it's amazing. There's very few, if any, work created that you could present that doesn't have some relevancy to present day, whenever the present day is. And you kind of have to tap into that and draw from that. Yeah.
Can I ask you, because as you're talking about this, the thing that I'm starting to think about is I imagine a curator can look at things through different lenses, and maybe this is different for different curators, but as you're looking and putting together this show, are you thinking about the original intention of the artists from that day and what they would have wanted to convey in their work? Or are you thinking more about our current audience and how it's going to resonate with people today? You see what I'm saying? Is it about fidelity to the original intention of the historical record, or is it about what we as an audience might need to see and understand in the work? Or are you trying to juggle a little bit of both? And
Yeah, I don't think the two are exclusive of each other. And I think that there's also many aspects to both of those sides, right? So what an artist trying to convey, there's a lot that feeds into that, right? There's their whole entire biography. There's kind of the moment in time and place in which they lived. There are the influences and access that they have, and then how that came out in the work. Or like in Hokusai's case, like just the necessity to work, right? He was a hustling artist his entire life, right? And that really led to the creation of some of his most iconic pieces, because he was broke and he wanted to make something that was popular.
That's why 36 views of Mount Fuji had 46 views.
Hey, that's right. You could keep them coming. So with that in mind, right, there's inevitably going to be parts of that story that resonate with contemporary audiences. So when I think about telling an artist's story, it's not like it's not like I come in and say, here's what the connections are. Is as you start to learn the story, they kind of reveal themselves, and then you say, oh, I wonder if that aspect of this type of work about how it's so much was popular came because it was work that came out of a long period of isolation that all of a sudden was exposed to the entire world, both in its influence, but also how it began to influence. So what happens in that moment, right? And I think that that's a very relevant discussion globally now, right? As we start to talk and think more about how different countries and cultures interact, and the freedom of that interaction and isolation versus like exposure. But then it's always important to talk about it through the work and the history in that workout won't ring true. I feel like you're trying to add something that isn't there, right?
Yeah.
And people are always fascinated with personal narratives, no matter what, because that's what they can relate to the most. So that's why it's helpful to have a lot of these large shows we've done have just been biographical exhibitions about a singular artist. But through this is why it helps to have Hokusai's story act as a kind of a guide through this period, because when you get to the personal story, then you find out not much really has changed, right? At its core, like the kind of conflicts and desires and goals of an individual. So I think it's back to your question. I think it's both, and then when it's something that's really well known, then what's important is really to think about, well, what is a lens that's maybe not as familiar, that people have heard before, to allow them, access back to that. So like when we did the Kahlo show, it was really important to me. And the co-curator at the time, the assistant curator at the time, Marcel Andrade, a lot of our conversations were, we didn't want to present her as kind of someone who was, who had been disadvantaged, who had suffered. I think her story was always about suffering. Mm-hmm. We wanted to acknowledge the suffering, but point to how she empowered herself, and she had a lot of agency in her life and her career, because we wanted to kind of counter that victim narrative. So, that also plays a role. And I think with this show, again, really talking about how a lot of times people talk about this period in Japan, it's all about the isolation. And that's why I really want to say, it's also the work that we most know about. The reason it's so well known, the reason it's so influential is the end of that isolation and kind of the explosion of influence that happened when there was this like global exchange that occurred towards the end of it. So,
yeah. And so I guess to wrap it up, I feel like I know my answer, but if somebody is thinking like, is this worth going to, what would be the big ideas, the selling points? Like, what do you want people to know coming into this, or why do you feel like this Hokusai and the Ukiyo-e exhibition is such a treasure for us to have here? Make the pitch so that I want to get some butts in the seats, because I want to keep seeing shows like this coming 10 minutes from my house.
Well, this is the first time this collection will be shown in the U.S., so it's not something that you can see a lot anywhere else. So there are versions of prints that may look familiar, but there's also a lot of one-of-a-kind hand-painted items that have never before been seen in the U.S. That opportunity alone, I think that this exhibit is more than just a wave. I think sometimes people hear Hokusai, they just think of the wave. Would this go so far beyond that in the presentation, not only of information and kind of what was going on in Edo, Japan, and with its artwork, but also the experience of the exhibit itself is going to be completely engrossing and engaging. It does have an immersive element, but it's very educational at the same time. And what's unique about our space versus other institutions is because we are at a community college, you'll find our exhibits are very welcoming. There's nothing kind of intimidating about this space. Sometimes you go to a museum, it feels like you're a little out of place, or maybe you're not as welcome because it feels more like a bank than something else. This space it's very much about learning and very much about the community. And it's not something you can see somewhere else. Once we take this down, this is not traveling somewhere else. All these elements aren't going from here to another part of the country. That's it. So it's just that period of time to see this unique presentation of some of the most influential artwork in the last 1,000 years, really.
Oh man, I am so thankful that it is at, like I said, my local college museum. I actually took classes at COD before I transferred to the Art Institute.
Yeah.
I know the campus well. I know the museum. I loved the Kahlo and Warhol, and I'm so excited about the Hokusai and Ukiyo-e, the Floating World exhibition happening at the Cleve Carney Museum of Art, opening May 31st, 2025. Thank you once again so much. I really appreciate you giving me your time and sharing your expertise. Justin Whitty, thank you so much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed being on.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.